Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. Once you've mastered the through dovetail and the half blind, what's next? Well, I'm going to suggest you try a houndstooth. I'm going to show you how to hand cut a houndstooth dovetail. It's actually easier than you think. Stay with me. Tell you everything I know. I'm Rob Cosman and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help you take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new to our channel, be sure to subscribe, turn on that notification bell, and don't forget to turn on the notification on your mobile device so you'll know every time we release a new video. Good? All right, back to the bench. A lot of woodworkers aspire to learning how to cut dovetails by hand. You can do them with jigs, you can do them with a table saw, bandsaw, but when you do them by hand, you own the joint. It's all your skill on display. And it's not that difficult. In fact, I'll leave a link below on tutorials that I've done on YouTube that will actually show you the process and walk you all the way through it. A through dovetail, for a quick review, is simply one where you see both the ends of the tails and the ends of the pins. The half blind is what you typically find at the front of a drawer, and that's where part of the joint is hidden. That actually takes a fair bit more work. But then if you want to move into something like this, as complicated as it looks, it really isn't that difficult. So we call it a houndstooth. And what you really do is you have little dovetails inside big dovetails. And probably the most difficult part is the actual layout and keeping everything organized when you're doing it, because there's so many lines it sometimes is easy to cut on the wrong side or cut in the wrong place. So what we're going to do is go through that process. I'm going to use a piece of cherry and a piece of walnut. We'll take you through the layout and we'll give you all those details. We'll skip over anything that would be redundant from previous videos, but by the end of it, you'll know how to lay out and cut and assemble a houndstooth dovetail. Great challenge. I'm often asked, where would you use something like this? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the strength and then address that issue of where's the most appropriate application. If you think about a dovetail, it's strong because you have so much glue surface, long grain gluing. So you've got this piece of whitewood gluing against the side of that piece of walnut, and that's repeated multiple times. The weak link on a dovetail usually happens right here at the baseline. For every other pin you put in, you remove some of that whitewood. So right along there, you've reduced the width of this piece by this minus that, and that, and that, and that. And if you put in 2 or 3 more, well, then just keep reducing it till that becomes where it's going to break. This is a way of strengthening that joint without weakening that baseline, because what you've done is you've moved put a second baseline in there. So now you've picked up the extra glue surface on both sides of those pins without weakening this one. Now, with all that said, do you really need that much strength? And I'm going to suggest that this is usually something that you want to put for decoration purposes only. Here's a sample half-blind dovetail out of a piece of walnut and poplar. And I'm going to put it on a slippery floor, and I'm pretty sure it'll hold my weight. So if you can stand on a corner like that, then there's probably no reason why you're ever going to need something to be even stronger than that. Certainly the wood is going to fail before the joint would. I've seen it used on the corners of a workbench to show off. This is actually something that came off of my wall. I made these to hold speakers. And I think being in a woodworking shop is just a bit of an eye-catching thing. Would I ever actually use it in something that I'm building, utilitarian piece, to replace a through dovetail in a drawer? No, it's not a ton of work, but as I stated, it's extra work for a benefit that you really don't need. The law of diminishing return kicks in somewhere. The joint's not going to fail with just those 3 tails, never mind having 6 if you count the little tiny ones. All right, so if you really want to show something off, do it. But if you're just looking for a way of putting something together, a box or a drawer, and make it really strong, regular dovetails are more than adequate. First of all, what are we going to use? I'm going to start, remember I'm using a piece of black walnut and black cherry. I'm going to square them up using my shooting board and my 5.5. And shooting boards are incredibly important to accurate joinery. The more square things are, the better the result. Then I'm going to lay out the joint. I'm going to use a pair of dividers. I'm going to use my dovetail marker. I'm going to use a red pen because it's easier to see. I'm going to use some yellow masking tape instead of what we used to do with a skew block plane. You'll see how that works. I need my marking gauge. I'm going to use my dovetail saw. I'm going to use my dovetail marking knife with the Sean shim, and I'll explain. You'll see how that works. I'll use a fret saw to remove the waste. I've got 3 chisels, a half, a quarter, and an eighth. And when you're doing a houndstooth, you have to have a chisel that'll fit in that small area. So an eighth of an inch is just going to go in there. Of course, I need my mallet with my chisels, and I like to put this particular joint together with a mallet. You'll see how when we get to that point. Now, there. I'm going to go ahead and label these. This is my pin board, and this is my tail board. Now, we'll go ahead and set the marking gauge. And in this case, I want it to be the exact thickness. So I put my marking gauge on like top like this, let it drop down, lock it. Then I'm going to take that dimension and I'm going to scribe the 2 faces of my pin board. Then I'll take my pin board and do the same thing and scribe all the way around the tailboard. Now at this point I've got to decide how big I want these little hound's teeth to be. So where do I want my baseline? That's pretty much in the halfway mark. So I'll do something like that. So I'm going to take my marking gauge and I'll set that right about there. Now this baseline is not going to go out here on the edges, it's just on the 2 faces. Now the reason why we need to make sure that when we set our marking gauge that it represents the exact thickness is I'm now going to create my baseline on this piece. So that line right there has to coincide with where it needs to be over here. So I'm going to mark, since I marked down from the top, I'm going to mark down from this face, and that will give me the baseline for those hound's teeth. So you can see if that was off a little bit, when you go to put that together, this baseline is not going to line up with that baseline, and it has to in order to get a good joint. Now, I'm going to go ahead and lay out the actual joint before I use the tape with the trick with the tape. Now I have this facing the camera. I normally would have it turned around. The first thing we're going to do is use a pair of dividers to establish our outside half pin. These are the pieces, these are the half pins. We want them to be robust enough that they look nice and strong. You make them too small, they look weak, and you make them too big, it throws it out of balance. So, and I really don't measure that. I just eyeball it based on the size of the joint. And I often think that that's an unfair statement to make to somebody who's never done this before. So I will tell you that if you use somewhere around 1/4 of an inch, you're probably going to be in line. However, as you do this more and more, you'll develop a keener eye for it, and you may want to change that dimension slightly. I'm going to set that right about there. So in from either end, actually that's a little bit too big, I'm going to drop it down just a bit. In from either end, I'm going to leave a little mark. And you don't want to make these too deep because it makes it very difficult to get rid of them when it comes time to clean up the joint. I'm going to use a 1:6 ratio. That represents about 10 degrees. And I'm going to draw a nice perpendicular line across the end of the board. And then from the gauge line, I'll come up. Nice thing about this dovetail marker, it allows you to do 2 things with 1 setting. Now I'll go flip it around and do this one. Now I'm looking at it, I'm thinking these are probably just a little bit bigger than I would have liked. I might have taken them down a little bit more, but we'll work with this. So now it's a matter of dividing up this space by 3 tails. And just in case I was going to be doing another corner, I would leave that set as it is, and that would be my half pin that I would take to the other side so that they would look the same when I'm done. I'll walk you through this real quick. Actually, we've done this in other videos, so I'm just going to go through and do this rather quickly. A little bit bigger than that. The amount we step over represents how big our inside pins are going to be. I'm going to go with that. So at this point, I'll leave a mark, leave a mark. When I get here, I replace the divider into that half pin and go back the other way. And then using my dovetail marker, go in and just lay those out. So here's where we vary from a typical through dovetail. We've got to go in now and we've got to make those other little dovetails in between these. And it's, as I said, it's really not that difficult. So as I said, I would normally have a pair of dividers so that I could carry that same joint. In this case, you'd almost need a third divider. So I'm going to take these and I want to have the same size pin in those. So what I'll do, starting on that side of the tail, and careful not to leave any marks, I'm just going to step once and I want to land on that second mark. And as soon as I get that, then I know I'll have the same size. You'll see how I do it. A little smaller yet. Okay, that's right on the mark. So now, starting on this side of that big tail, I'll leave a mark, and then I come over here and I start on that side of the tail and leave a mark. And just do that. Repeat that through all of them. Now, this is our baseline, and it's a little bit hard to see. I'm going to made it fairly faint, but we're going to go in and using the exact same technique, only this time we're going down to that shorter baseline. Always want to make sure that these marks across the end of the board are right on parallel. I prefer to put my pen in that little hole left by the divider and move the gauge over until it touches. Then you know it's located exactly where you want. Then turn around and repeat. And mostly so the camera can pick it up, I'm just going to then run that through that gauge line, and it'll make it easier for you to see. So my last step before I start cutting, I want to come in and I want to very clearly identify the waste, the part that's going to be removed. So it's going to be all of this. It's going to be this. Inside pin. Okay, last step, and this is the tape trick. So I'm using Automotive Refinish masking tape, which turns out to be a little bit thicker than regular masking tape and stickier. So I'm going to just go over that main baseline, and I'll put 4 pieces. Be sure to rub that well so that it sticks. Now I want to trim off the excess on the sides first. Hey, if you like this video, we have more. Our newsletter has subscriber-only content, monthly discount on tools, and anything we bring out that's new, subscribers get first crack at it. Click on the link below. Let's get back to work. Now I'm going to reset my marking gauge. I'm going to reset it to that baseline at the bottom of the big tails, and then carefully, using several strokes, I'm going to cut through and then remove that piece. Oh, didn't get to the bottom. Now that will give me a nice tape wall that will be able to lay up against the pin board when it comes time. But next move is to put this in place and saw out these tails. Always want that board standing plumb. Now this is where you want to check your cuts. And if you're not right down to the baseline, it's worth putting it back in the vise and going and doing it again, simply because having to go in there with the chisel and create a corner is a lot harder than putting the saw back in and finishing it right down to the line. Okay, now I want to remove this fuzz from the back side. This is just from the saw. And the reason I'm making sure this is gone is I don't want it to interfere with the way the tailboard is going to lay up against the pin board. Take my tailboard. The good side is going to be facing me. I'm going to put my plane on its side, drop the tailboard down. I'll use this as a reference to bring it up so that the top of the pin board is flush with the top of the plane. Set that back, and that tape is going to create a wall that allows me to bring this tailboard right up to it. And then that keeps everything perfectly lined up. And I'm going to have to move this forward and back a little bit, so that's even better, instead of me trying to use my thumbs to keep that lined up. Now this is where we introduce what's called the Sean shim. And this was developed by a combat wounded vet that came to one of our classes, Sean McDermott. And Sean had this idea. We turned it into a product. You'll notice that there's 4 settings on there, 4 numbers. They represent thousandths of an inch. My saw has a kerf that's 24 thousandths of an inch, so that's the one I'm going to use, particularly with a couple of hardwoods. And I'm going to offset the tailboard from the pin board by the thickness of 1 saw kerf. And I'm going to push this to my left first, so I'm going to have it so that the large piece of the Sean shim is up on top. So I reference it just like that, and then put that on there, slide it over. Hold that in place. Use my dovetail marking knife, and that little sawtooth blade is the exact same as my dovetail saw. So when I put it down in that kerf, it doesn't wiggle side to side. If I offset the tailboard to my right, actually, let's go in here and identify where the tails are. So this is a tail, this is a bigger tail, this is a tail, 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 tail. So if I've offset my tailboard to my right, I'm going to go to the left side. Pardon me, if I offset to my left, I'm going to go to the right side of each tail. So I'm going to drag my knife through this mark. I'm going to drag it through this kerf. Sorry, I'm going to drag it through this kerf, this one, and this one. And then I'll repeat the process going in the other direction. So offset to my left, mark to the right of the tail. Put that down in there. And it's shaped such that you can actually get that right down into that corner. And then carefully drag it through. And it helps to do it 3 or 4 times. Get yourself a really good mark. Go to that next one. And then the next one. After we've done all of one side, now we need to do the other. So I'm going to turn my Sean shim around, still using the 25. And in case you're wondering, I can make the joint a little tighter or a little more loose depending on the species of wood by going and using one of these other settings. But for right now, I'm going to use the 24 thou. This time, the larger piece is going to be on the bottom. That's going to allow me to move the tailboard over until it touches. I've now offset by the thickness of 1 saw kerf to my right. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to mark the left side and the left side of each tail. So if this is a tail, I'm going to go in and mark this one. I'm holding that tailboard firmly with my left hand. Can't have that move. Okay, now there's all of my marks, and what's great about that is I simply set my saw right into that kerf, and I don't have to try to guess where I should be starting. However, it's going to be a little bit challenging. I'll walk you through that. Now, I leave this alone just in case something happens that I screw this up. If I leave it like that, I can still do this again. Once you've removed the waste, you can't. So we'll set that off to the side. Now, I'm going to come in here. I'll turn it around to make it easier to see. And I'm going to finish these lines, more for reference when it comes to sawing. And I'm going to take them right down. Actually, let's do this first, from up here on the top. So we're keeping this, which means this is waste. This is where it can get confusing. We're keeping this, we're keeping that, we're keeping this. Everything with a hash mark is going to be removed. Now over here, we're going to turn our dovetail marker around so that it works as a square, and we're going to run lines down to that baseline. Okay, doesn't hurt to bring these lines over onto the front. Now, I've been doing this a long time, and I still will have days when I have to stop and just kind of envision what this is supposed to look like to make sure I've got everything exactly where it needs to be. So now I can go in, and I think I'm going to be okay. Sometimes, depending on the way you lay it out, in trying to make this saw cut, you end up cutting off a piece of that. But if you can see, I'm going to be sawing, in sawing along the side of this little pin, I'm still going to be in the waste. So I'm good on all of these, so that won't cause a problem. So we'll put this in the vise. Want to make sure it's standing plumb. Keep it low in the vise so that it doesn't vibrate. And then we'll get out the saw and go to work. It's amazing how much better you can do when you can actually see, so never enough light. Set this saw right in that kerf. Careful to stop at the baseline. Now that baseline is really faint, so what I'm going to do is take a piece of tape and put it right along the bottom. Save myself a lot of squinting. So I'm going to do this one over here just because the light's shining on that side, so it's easier to make these cuts first.
Go.
Okay, so this is the confusing part. What do we remove? Well, I see hash marks on this piece, so let's just take this one at a time. So I'm going to remove that piece right there. I'll drop my fret saw down to the bottom, come up just slightly. Remember, I don't have much of a gap here, so I'm going to have to swing this saw around. Get a few of these out and it becomes easier to understand. So this piece has marks all the way, so I know it needs to be removed. closer you can cut to the baseline, the less material you have to chisel. Same thing here. I've got hash marks all the way. Cut a little deep. Hash marks all the way. Okay, so those are the very obvious ones. Now, this one has got hash marks, this one, and this one. So what I'm going to do, just to make it real easy to see, I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to cut just to that line. So I'm looking down from the top, and I'll do that from, see if we can get that saw blade out without ripping it, breaking it. No, it doesn't want to. I'm going to have to chisel that out. Okay, come over here. Remember, don't go past that baseline. And then go over here. Then we'll come in here and do the same thing. Careful not to go past that baseline. I'm going to take my chisel and my mallet with the bevel facing the back side, and I'm just going to get rid of some of this material. I'm going to sneak up to that line. I won't get too close just yet, but just enough so that I can start to see the shape of the joint. That's going to make it a lot easier for me to envision what I'm doing and hopefully prevent me from making any fatal mistakes, which would involve removing the wrong piece. Okay, now at this point, I can see my marking gauge mark. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm doing my best to pare straight down, and I'll just keep getting closer and closer to that line until I've removed most of the waste, so there's very little pressure being applied by the waste against the bevel, trying to force the chisel this way. Then I can set my chisel, and you should be able to feel it drop right into that gauge line and just pare straight down. Same thing over here. It's always easier to take several small pieces than to try to do it with one big one. Okay, we're close enough. We can set it in there, and you want to be able to feel it when the chisel engages. All right, now let's get rid of that material back there. And you may be able to do it just by pushing with the chisel, or you may have to use a little bit of help from the mallet. But I'm just being careful. I don't want to break that off. Not that that would happen, but if you were using a mallet, you could. I'll come down from the top and get rid of some more of this. Okay, we've got some more work to do, but that's now defined, and I know the exact shape of that little pin. All right, I'm going to take that tape off. Now, I would prefer to have been closer to my gauge line than that, but I wasn't. So this is going to require a 1/4 inch chisel, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to remove the bulk of the material first, just to back the pressure off when I do put the chisel in the gauge line. And in case you don't understand what I mean by that, any of the waste is going to put pressure on the bevel of the chisel and try to force it this way, and that screws up my baseline. Now I'm going to finish the rest of this in the vise so I can pay close attention to what's happening around that small pin. And I've already got my outside lines, which are the important ones. Those are the ones that are going to meet the tailboard and provide you with a nice tight-fitting joint. And if I undercut these a little bit, it won't matter, but I'm just going to go in and break free that material in between. You never want to pry because you don't want to bruise that line. Don't even want to bruise it on the inside either. Now I'm working from the front to the back so I can run across the side of the pin like that. So that one's nice and clean, that one's nice and clean. I'll just finish up this last one. Our last check, we want to make sure that the back of these small pins is actually plumb. If it isn't and it slopes toward the back, when you put your joint together, it's going to spread it and you're going to have a gap here. So what I'm going to do is just put this chisel down to the bottom, and if I eyeball that, I see that it's actually leaning forward. So I've got to take some off of there. Check this one. Same thing. And this one, same thing. So I suspect it's because the grain is running a little bit like that and it guided the chisel. So I'll come in here, just in from the top, and then make a paring cut. And hopefully take enough off of that to correct that problem. That's one of those things that sometimes people forget to do, and then they wonder why they end up with a gap. So now when I look at that, that looks better. That one still needs to have some more taken off. And that one could use a little bit too. Okay, so the pin board is ready. Now I'll go at the tailboard. I can take this piece of tape off. Now we're going to go in and we're going to drop down the kerf and we're going to cut along that base line. This we'll do with a dovetail saw. We're going to cut along that base line, along here, here, and here. You ready? Yeah. Other than the fact that it's small, removing this waste is pretty much straightforward. So I'm using my 1/8 inch This is where it really pays. If you had taken your saw right to the gauge line, it makes it so much easier than trying to get in that tight spot and create a sharp corner. Nice and clean. Ready? Mm-hmm. Now I managed to saw right to the corner on those, so that was easy. Our final step before assembly, we want to come in and we want to chamfer all these edges. Makes it easier to put it together and helps with the glue distribution. You don't want to come out to the end. So what we'll do is start in about a 1/16 of an inch and just cut a little chamfer down the inside of each tail. If you go to the end, you'll end up having a little triangular hole in your joint. So, and I choke up on the chisel. So hopefully I'll have more control. If you want, you can clamp that in place, and again, keep both hands behind the chisel, and then you're not going to cut yourself. Now finally, we'll just clip these off. Okay, no debris. Now, we'll get cleaned up. There's a lot of surface area in this joint, so you want to be quick, because as soon as you put the glue on there, it's going to start sucking up that moisture and swelling. So I use a spatula. I find it more precise than a knife. Do all of those. And this little glue bottle really helps too, because instead of me having to go to a bigger bottle or puddle of glue on a stick of wood somewhere, I've got it right here where I want it. I'm only gluing the sides, the long grain sides of these pins. Now working on the inside of this, tight spot. Put it in place by hand first, meaning start it by hand so that you know it's where it needs to be, and then tap it home. Splatters. Now you want to make sure that it's seated, and it's not quite, so my square. That's nice and square. It's seated down there. Wipe off the excess. And there's enough friction with that joint that we can clean it up right now. So I'll use my plane, a little bit of wax to reduce the friction. Pull that blade in. Just feeling for any plane tracks. Now we'll flush up the sides. So there's your Houndstooth Dovetail, done in cherry and walnut. If you enjoy my method of work and like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the plane and chisel icon below, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our in-person and online workshops.